Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark from the United States.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Mark from the States. How are we doing today? I am doing fantastic. I hope you are as well. Thank you so much for coming. This is Miss Violet over here. She's here hanging out with us. Let's see if I can get a picture of her. She's just, sorry, we interrupted her cleaning. Thank you so much for coming. I got a big fake couch here. Would love for you to come sit with me today. Requested video is the burglary of the 1303 Crown Jewels burglary. This is by the history guy. Thank you for the suggestion and the request. I appreciate it. Of course, the history guy has blessed us with his permission to view him. I get a lot of requests for stuff on his channel. I love it. One, links below. Yes, please go support channel and video. Please get over there. One like, one subscription today to give. I encourage you to give it to him. It's important that you do so. Also, this sounds familiar to me. Now, I think there was multiple, I want to say there was multiple attempts, or 1303 does not sound familiar to me. So I'm not quite sure what we're going to be watching today. So this is going to be new. Maybe this I vaguely remember us doing a video a few years ago on a burglary, and it might even have been by the history guy. I don't know if this is the same video. I don't think so, because this doesn't sound too familiar. The date doesn't sound too familiar to me. I don't know. Guarantee a lot of it that I've forgotten anyway, if I did. It's just kind of how things are. So anyway, come sit with me on this big fake couch. Let's get into this. This is burglary, Crown Jewels, 1303.
In the summer of 1303, King Edward I of England was in Scotland on campaign when a courier arrived with some shocking news. Tens of thousands of pounds worth of silver and gold had been stolen from the royal treasury from what was believed to be the most secure room in the whole of England. In 1303, Edward I, so tall that he was known as Edward Longshanks, had ruled for 31 years. He conquered and seized control of Wales and fought a war with France over his holdings on the continent called the Gascon War, but peace with France in 1303 had allowed him to focus his attention north, as Scotland had rebelled in what would much later be called the First War for Scottish Independence. The website History Things Explains, with tongue-in-cheek, a former Scottish knight named William Wallace, played by Mel Gibson, had raised resistance in Scotland. Edward returned to fight Wallace's rebellion, a fight that kept Edward away for long periods of time.
We all know how accurate Braveheart is. It's like critics and historians have come out and said how accurate and right on par with history that movie is. Right? Yes, it has its flaws, but it is very, very entertaining. And I remember hearing of Longshanks in the movie. Of course, I think Harris was the actor who played him. I forget his first name, but he wasn't very tall. But nevertheless, there was a lot of liberties taken, obviously. But man, the movie was very entertaining.
But while those two were up north making Braveheart, the plot that was developing back in London was much more like Ocean's 11. The church known today as Westminster Abbey began as a Benedictine monastery that was in existence at least by the middle of the 10th century.
Now that would be a good movie, like a Ocean's 11 type heist of these. Is there a movie like that out there that I'm not aware of? Let me know.
The monastery was greatly expanded in the 11th century, including a stone church under the patronage of the Anglo-Saxon king Edward the Confessor, namesake of Edward Longshanks. The website of the abbey explains that this church became known as the Westminster to distinguish it from St. Paul's Cathedral, the East Minster, in the city of London. Since 1066, the abbey has been the location where English monarchs are crowned. The cathedral and monastery had been expanded under both Henry III and his son Edward Longshanks. But one of the oldest parts of the castle, original to the time of Edward the Confessor, is the Pyx Chamber. The website of Westminster Abbey explains that the low-vaulted room off the east cloister is part of the undercroft, underneath the monks' dormitory, which was built around 1070. The term pyx refers to a small round box. Pyxes are often used in churches to hold the Eucharist, but that is not how the chamber got its name. In this case, pyx referred to a round container used to hold coins. The Royal Mint Museum writes that since at least 1282, coins produced by the Royal Mint have been independently checked in a proceeding known as the Trial of the Pyx, which takes its name from the pyx, or box in which were kept the sample coins set aside for testing. The point of the trials is to independently check the coinage to ensure the coins contain the proper amount of precious metals. The master of the mint was required to set aside 1 coin per 10 pounds of silver. The coins would then be melted down and tested under the supervision of the Baron of the Exchequer.
Wow.
The chamber was called the Pyx Chamber because the boxes of coins to be tested were taken and stored here at a stone table in the back of the chamber, sometimes mistaken as an altar, was used to do the testing. Edward I had reformed coinage to create a more reliable currency, and rules for the trial, to be done every 3 months, were established likely in 1279. The trial of the Pyx, though more ceremonial in purpose, continues today. It is likely because the room was used to hold the coinage that it also came to be used to hold the treasury. The website of Westminster Abbey writes the chamber was walled off in the 12th century and made into a treasury in the 13th century. In his 2005 book, The Great Crown Jewels Robbery of 1303, historian Paul Doherty writes that the crypt of Westminster was a treasure house, housing most of the royal regalia of the Crown of England, as well as jewels, silver and gold coins, goblets, jugs, chalices, cups, saucers, spoons, vases, not to mention unique treasures. The king had reason to house his valuables there. The website On London explains that with its 13-foot thick walls, it had long been considered the most secure room in the whole of the kingdom. It had 2 heavy oak doors, one behind the other, each with 3 locks, meaning 6 keys were required to gain admittance. Doherty explains that the keys to the treasure were held in secured, sealed pouches by senior officials at the king's wardrobe. The Benedictine monks at the abbey were dedicated to their vows. The king, who might have had to use the jewels as collateral to borrow money, if need be, to fund his war in Scotland, would have had reason to trust that they were well protected in the crypt at Westminster. But there was an issue. In his 1916 book, A Medieval Robbery, Thomas Frederick Tout writes that Edward had moved most of the government north to be more convenient to him while he conducted his fight against the Scots. While the king was only for the first time able to dedicate most of his efforts against the Scots owing to the recent peace with France, the war had been going since 1296. By 1303, Tout notes, the king, court, and government offices had been moved to York for over 5 years. In his 1873 work, A History of Crime in England, Luke Owen Pike, a historical researcher at the United Kingdom's Public Record Office, writes that in the king's absence, there was no bodyguard at the palace. Every soldier that could be spared was in active service in the field. This made for poor security. Tout notes, under medieval conditions, the eye of a vigilant taskmaster was an essential condition of efficiency. It followed that during Edward's long absence, things at Westminster were allowed to drift into an extraordinary state of confusion and disorder. The keeper of the castle at Westminster, John Sench, had not even been appointed by Edward, but was instead an inherited position. With the king and court away, Tout estimates that Sench and his underling, William, became less than responsible. Soon John and William, in the absence of the higher authorities, seemed to have gathered together a band of disreputable boon companions of both sexes, whose drunken revels and scandalous misconduct was soon notorious throughout the neighborhood. One element in this band of revelers was, I regret to say, a certain section of the monks of the neighboring monastery. For as the absence of the king and the court had left the palace asleep, as it were, so also had the monastery at Westminster sunk into a deeper and more scandalous slumber. The abbot, Walter of Wenlock, Tout writes, was an old man whose hold on the monks was slight. It followed, Tout writes, naturally that many of the 50 monks became slack beyond ordinary standards of medieval slackness. This group of disreputable companions would eventually include Richard of Pudlicott, who Doherty describes as a former merchant and a charming, dissolute rogue with a grudge against the king. Pudlicott had made a living, Tout explains, as a wandering trader in wool, cheese, and butter. He had been in Flanders trading wool. Edward had allied with Flanders against France in a campaign in 1297 that had turned out to be disastrous. When Edward left Flanders, he left behind a great deal of debt. Seeking to ensure that the king would pay his debt, Flemish authorities arrested several English merchants, held them as hostages. Tout writes, Edward's credit was so bad that we can hardly blame the Flemings for leaving no stone unturned to obtain payment of their debts. Pudlicott was among those arrested.
Oh,
managed to escape and return back to London. He had to leave his
man with a grudge.
Behind, a problem which he apparently blamed on Edward I. Tout writes, like many bankrupts, he seemed to have generally had enough money to indulge in all the personal gratifications that he had a special mind to practice. It seems that in the pursuit of his disreputable pleasures, Pudlicott was brought into contact with John Sench. William of the Palace and the other merrymakers, lay and ecclesiastical, in the lodge of the King's Palace of Westminster. The proximity of the abbey to the palace allowed him access there as well, where, Tout suggests, he was impressed that the monks were served on silver plates, something which he surmised he might acquire as a way to reimburse himself for the debts he felt were owed to him by the king. Tout writes that Pudlicott simply found a ladder, climbed through a window. Thence he made his way to the refectory and secured a rich booty of plate, which he managed to carry off and sell. But Pudlicott's lifestyle meant that the proceeds from the plates did not serve his needs for long, and, Tout writes, by the end of 1302, Richard was again destitute and looking out for something to steal. And steal he would. Pike writes that on the 26th of April and succeeding days, great numbers of precious stones and all kinds of gold work and silver work were offered to sale to the goldsmiths of London and bought by them with a readiness which did them no credit. A rumor soon traveled from mouth to mouth that the royal treasury, which was within the abbey but close to the Palace of Westminster, had been entered and robbed. The Stoke-on-Trent Evening Sentinel wrote in 1957, "The city goldsmith rubbed his chin and turned the gold goblet over in his hands. If he wondered how the seller had come by it, he asked no questions." In the spring of 1303, transactions of the same kind were being made all over London. It seemed as if a shower of treasure had fallen upon the town, but most people shrugged the matter off as being no business of theirs.
Oh.
But it was very much the business of crown officials when it was discovered that the royal regalia stored in Westminster Abbey had been robbed to the tune of £100,000 or more. Pike writes, it's not easy to state the modern equivalent of such a sum, but materials for an estimate might be found in the fact that the whole revenue of the kingdom amounted to no more than £40,000 about 30 years prior to the robbery. When
Oh
the
my
news was taken
gosh.
to the king, Doherty writes that the crime was so brazen that the king's first reaction was probably to dismiss such reports as nonsense. In Edward I's mind, Doherty writes, theft from him was synonymous with treason, and someone would have to pay. Pike writes that the king established a commission of inquiry. The commission consisted of juries representing all the wards of London, as well as a jury of goldsmiths and aldermen, whose job it was to collect and review evidence. The website of English Heritage writes that immediately after the shocking theft of much of this treasure, suspicion fell on the abbot and monks, who consequently were all briefly imprisoned in the Tower of London. The Evening Sentinel writes that soon the prisons were full. The alleged culprits included the abbot and the sacrist, several monks and lay brethren, city merchants, and women of the town, of diverse hall, each protesting their innocence. And it wasn't long before the hall included Richard, a Pudlicott. For being such a fantastic crime, it wasn't difficult to determine the culprit. Pudlicott, who was arrested with nearly £2,000 of booty on him.
Oh my gosh. I'm surprised he wasn't the first one arrested. They've just basically taken everybody in. Everybody starts telling people who's who, and unreal. Hey, yeah, they obviously didn't think it would get around. Them spending it in the town of London, the city of London.
Confessed. How had he managed to rob the most secure vault in the realm? Tout explains the story from Pudlicott's confession. Having resolved to rob the treasury, came to the conclusion that the best way to tackle the business was to pierce a hole through the wall of 13 feet of stone that supported the tower story of the chapter house. To do so, Pudlicott sowed some hempweed in front of a window to obscure the view, and during the dark nights of winter and spring, drilled through the solid masonry.
No
He
way.
worked on the hole until a fortnight after Easter, and on the night of Wednesday, the eve of St. Mark, he got into the treasury, stayed inside through St. Mark's Day, sorting out the things he wanted to carry off, and on the following night he got out, leaving part of the treasure underneath the bush to recover it the next night. In his confession, Pudlicott refused to name any accomplices. Tout writes, "Such is Pudlicott's story. It is the tale of a bold ruffian who glories in his crime and is proud to declare, 'I alone did it.'" That story was not quite believable. Pike writes that it's quite evident that a procedure which required more than 4 months for its accomplishment could not have been successful had there been no collusion within the Abbey gates. The findings of the various juries pointed to a deep-laid conspiracy between some persons in the Abbey and others in the neighboring palace. Tout writes that he has no doubt that he must have had accomplices both inside and to whom he could hand out the contents. Most of the stolen items were quickly recovered. Some were found in odd places, like laying in ditches or caught in fishermen's nets. The official William of the castle and 4 other lay people were convicted and hanged, although it isn't clear whether they were hanged for the crime itself or for dereliction of duty. 10 monks were also arrested and held in the tower for 2 years, but Edward eventually released them, apparently because he didn't want more trouble with the church. And the guy that was in charge of it all, the keeper of the castle, Cinch, was given his hereditary job back. History things...
No way. That guy kept his job? Oh my gosh.
Called Richard of Pudlicott the dumbest criminal of the 1300s, noting that he had plenty of money to get away, but instead he just hung around London waiting to get caught. But Tout says that there was a touch of heroism and of devotion in our hero, thus taking upon himself the whole blame. But Richard was made an example of. He was not just hanged, but he was flayed, and his skin was, according to legend, nailed to the door of the treasury to deter other thieves, although that story turns out to be apparently apocryphal. Paul Doherty
still
writes
nasty.
that the crypt and the chapel of Pix were never again used to store royal treasure, and that they fell into disuse, and that Pudlicott and the robbery were forgotten. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy.
Get over there and do that, please.
And if you...
Just an amazing story. I mean, first of all, this is different than the one that I learned before. I kind of remember the jewels were in the Tower of London the last time we revisited a robbery of crown jewels, I believe. So this was new to me that they actually kept them in Westminster. The fact that it was named Westminster because of St. Paul's was considered the Eastminster, I guess, or the other Minster. So that's cool. Hopefully that one sticks. That's kind of cool information. The fact that John Cinch got his job back. I mean, seriously? And then this Pudlicott, the Richard guy, I forget his name. Pudlicott, I think is one. I mean, of course, he was looking to get caught. I mean, sit there and brag about it and all that stuff. And the fact that they retrieved all the jewels in gutters, fishing nets, wherever. I mean, obviously, people aren't going to have that sort of thing. The normal citizens of London aren't going to have those sort of things. So it's pretty suspicious if you come across something like that. Yeah, and people were probably, this is how I assume they ended up in gutters and fishing nets and so on and so forth. People were trying to get rid of them because they didn't want to be accused of being in on the heist. So they were just dumping them out wherever they could. Yeah, it's a crazy story. Everybody was at war. He didn't leave anybody there except a non-elected or basically, hey, okay, you're now in charge. The monks even got corrupted. The photos they kept showing, the paintings they kept showing were these monks drinking. Paintings, I don't know, drawings, whatever they were. I mean, yeah, greed. It's a powerful thing. It's a powerful thing, especially back then when everybody had nothing, and all of a sudden, and the fact that all he did was put up a piece of hemp and drilled through the walls for 4 months. just crazy. Crazy story. Crazy story. That was awesome. Thank you for the suggestion. This was not the video that I thought I'd already seen. The other one definitely took place at the Tower of London, and that one wasn't successful, I believe, if I remember correctly. Also included an inside guy, if I remember right. But yeah, there's a lot more information that I'm going to get from you in the comments and emails. Thank you so much for in advance for putting a little more on that. It's just wild. I love learning and seeing stories like this from history, because nowadays you're just like, how on earth? Just the fact that it just blows me away. The guy got his job back. Blows me away. All right, well, there you have it. I hope everybody's happy, healthy, and safe. Thank you so much for coming. I appreciate all of you. I really do. You guys are amazing. You have anything to say, Violet? She does not. Well, have a great day, and we'll see you again. All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Mark from the States, Mark from the States, it's Mark. And he's from